This year, we are thrilled to welcome an esteemed panel of experts on the Symposium on Bidenomics today. Joining us is Maggie Switek, Senior Director of Research at the Milken Institute, whose insights bridge global economic strategies and policy implications. Alongside her, we have Professor Pablo Kurlat and Romain Ranciere from USC, whose works in economics, finance, and business economics critically evaluates the intersection of policy market dynamics and economic growth. Completing our panel is Claudia Sahm, founder of Sahm Consulting, and a former Federal Reserve Board Section Chief, known for her pragmatic approach to macroeconomic policy and her keen insights into fiscal strategies. Together, their diverse expertise will offer a comprehensive analysis of Biden's economic policies shaping our future. Moderating our discussion today is myself, President of the Economics Association, and Daniel Mora, Director of External Affairs. The post-COVID economy was marked by a divisive economic and budgetary situation with a record unemployment rate and budget deficit. Coming into the current fiscal year, we have seen a reversal of the post-COVID economy. Despite anticipation of recession, there's been an observed decline in the unemployment rate, rise in real wages, strong GDP growth, and a rapid fall in the inflation rate. The economic approach under President Biden, referred to as Bidenomics, is characterized by markedly expansionary fiscal policy with increased spending to limit bottlenecks with little increase in taxation through support main policies, the Jobs Act, the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Act, and the CHIPS Act. The Federal Reserve has taken a stance of tightening monetary policy through consistent interest rate hikes since 2022. So my question is, according to traditional economic policies, battling inflation will require mass unemployment that never came to fruition. To what extent are Biden's expansionary fiscal and monetary policy responsible for the strong economy, or are these numbers the fiscal blip caused by a fiscal lag?
Thank you all for coming here. So I would say that the idea that bringing down inflation was going to require a period of high unemployment is not something that is in the textbook of macroeconomics, and it's not something that if you understood modern macroeconomics you should have expected. I think the idea was based on an extrapolation from what happened in the 1980s, where the last time we had high inflation, there was a period of high unemployment while we brought down inflation. But there was a key difference between what happened then and what was going on in the last couple of years, which is that at no point over the last 3-4 years did the expectations of medium-term inflation get out of hand. If you looked at what happened in the 1980s, people thought, oh, inflation is a problem we're never going to be able to get rid of, and it took a while of a deep recession to persuade people to sort of stop making their plans on the basis of expecting high inflation over the following few years. If you looked at what measures of expected inflation were like in 2021, 2022, people were, if you looked at like the markets where you can read inflation expectations by seeing at what rate are indexed bonds trading and at what rate are regular bonds trading. And by measuring that gap, you can see what the market expected inflation was going to be. And if the market consistently expected inflation to come back down, so our textbook models say, as long as inflation expectations are that inflation is going to come down, it's not really so hard to bring down inflation. And that's sort of what we saw. There's some argument as to whether, inflation was going to come down anyway, or whether we really needed to raise interest rates the way we did to bring it down. And that's a bit hard to resolve. But the idea that it was going to need a deep recession to do it, I think was based on a misreading of the evidence and a misreading of modern macroeconomic theory. So I think what we have seen over the past couple of years is basically normal. I don't think it's like super credit to what the administration has done, but it's also not that they did anything wrong. It's sort of what you would have expected. That's at least the way I see it.
Okay, so I will not repeat what just Pablo said very well. So I think what I will comment on is on the mix of monetary fiscal policy. That it's important because that's where you see a big contrast between what's happening in the US now and what is about to happen or what is already happening in Europe. So in Europe, they are both at the same time, hiking monetary policy and kind of tightening fiscal policy in order to control deficit and to bring the debt down and maybe to keep the credibility of monetary policy because of that. So the US is special in a sense that there is a tightening of monetary policy and expansion of fiscal policy at the same time. So this, I think, was successful, I think, for the reason Pablo mentioned, but also for something that, I mean, maybe people like Claudia will be better than me to comment, but I think people were not expecting the unemployment rate to be able to go so rapidly, so low, without creating additional inflationary pressure. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's one point. The second point is that I think there is something that people expect with fiscal policy, which is different monetary policy. So monetary policy acts with some lags, typically 18 months. So it means that the effect of tightening have not been fully absorbed yet. I think it will be another year, I think, until the effect will be fully absorbed. And I think there might be a slowdown of GDP because of that we haven't seen yet. So what's happened with fiscal policy, which is a little bit a question mark, is that we know that it can affect demand in the short run, but people say that a good mix of fiscal policy can also affect supply in the medium run. So I think that's a little bit, and that's something that was discussed already during Obama times, when Jason Furman was the chief of economic advisors, but was not really pursued. There were a bit of research that saw that fiscal policy could have a kind of a bounce back effect after like 2-3 years. And Biden has kind of formalized that by saying that if we do smart fiscal policy, we will actually reduce some kind of bottleneck, which actually can bring economic growth to a higher level and can also potentially reduce future inflation. And so that's the idea that if you do supply support fiscal policy, targeting in some place where there's bottleneck, like infrastructures or the semiconductor industry, that might also have both effect, reducing medium inflation and then helping occurring inflation expectations, and also boosting potential, GDP potential to a higher level.
Yes, so speaking precisely to the fiscal policies, if we go back and think about the policies that Biden really implemented, or that were implemented under his administration, let me put it like that. So we see there was the American Rescue Act that was in March of 2021. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that came already in November of 2021. Now, if we think about how unemployment was behaving at the same time, so we do know that unemployment went to a record high during the pandemic, but I believe by March of 2021, it was at double digits back during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic. By March of 2021, it had come down to around 6%. By November of 2021, when the Infrastructure and Jobs Act was signed, it was already around 4% and has stayed around there since. So if we think to what extent the fiscal policies were responsible for avoiding a recession, I mean, they have definitely been helpful, but I don't know if responsible is the word to be used in there. So when it comes to what Pablo was saying, I agree that the general sense is that there's nothing unexpected or fully unexpected about what has happened. The one thing that does distinguish this moment from any other moment from the 80s or from any other moment that we have had is that we have to remember we just are following a pandemic. So a lot of what is happening with employment growth in particular is still actually a rebound from the pandemic. You may not believe that's true still in 2023, 2024, but if you look at the leisure and hospitality industry, in many areas of the United States, I'm not saying United States as a whole, but if we break it down into city level, if we break it down into the metropolitan statistical area level, there are still MSAs that have not fully bounced back in terms of employment from the pandemic. So that is part of what is also driving this, what we have seen in the past years. Now, finally, when it comes to the monetary policies, the Fed has been actually quite good at keeping the interest rates high. And they have not dropped them. I remember I was at a panel with a lot of people from the finance sector, no economists, but a lot of financiers back in December of 2023. And they were all saying the Fed is just going to drop interest rates immediately, probably even still in 2023, definitely at the beginning of 2024. I told them, don't expect that to happen. It will still be a bit of time, especially with this strong labor market that we are observing. The economists were right. Me was right. So that is, I love that story because it's the one time that economists can say that our predictions actually come to reality. So, so the Fed has definitely contributed in that respect by its consistency and its stability in following through the policy that it established for itself. So in general, that is a little bit of the context and of my contribution to this.
Hi, Professor Sahm, we can hear some of your opinions.
So you're ready for me now? Sorry. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you again for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person with the rest of you. So just to add on to what were all great comments, I think stepping back when I think about what's happened in this cycle, and honestly, I think we have to go back before the pandemic, right, and work all the way through. For some of the pandemic response, it's very hard, I think, in the fiscal space to separate what happened under the Biden administration and what's happened under the Trump administration, right? Like there was a big response. And fundamentally, we have to understand that this was about COVID, right? It and the reactions that we had to it, both policy responses and behavioral responses, that caused these disruptions. This is not in our textbooks, right? And so there are a lot of usual relationships that broke down. And so I think that's caused a lot of uncertainty, a lot of people, making predictions that didn't come to pass. And yet a big theme, and you all have talked about this was a moment of big fiscal. There were lessons drawn and contested that after the great global financial crisis, fiscal went too small, particularly in the beginning, because that's usually the shot you have is in the depth of the crisis to do something. Politics often switch around and you're more into an austerity or you just can't do more later. This time we went big in the first year. I mean, I like to give the example just with the stimulus checks that I worked on. We had 3 rounds of stimulus checks. A family of 4, so 2 adults, 2 kids, got $11,400 within a year. That's almost 20% of U.S. median family income. And that's just one piece of all the relief that was put out. So fiscal went absolutely big. We learned fiscal is very powerful. Maybe too powerful. Like we need to spend a lot more time as macroeconomists thinking about how to design really good, really effective fiscal policy, because it just blew monetary policy out of the water. Because I mean, it's very direct, it can be very pinpointed, it can be very big. So fiscal policy, we learned it can do a lot. We avoided a lot of the damage that we've seen in prior recessions. Now this one was different. Like this was probably going to be more of this, like we shut things down, we open it up, we come back. And yet as we get further from 2021 and the last of the big fiscal packages, the labor market in particular started to get a very virtuous cycle going between it and consumers. And we already knew households had built up something of a buffer financially, which they never have. The hot, as the Fed calls it, or I think just the full employment economy was working for the bottom in terms of the wage gains. I mean, we have seen things that we have not seen in generations in terms of the labor market working. We've actually closed some of the long-standing wage inequality gaps. We made a lot. Aaron Dubé has some nice research on this. So we're learning a lot about how great it is to have an economy that's working. if you ask a lot of Americans, they'll tell you how great it is not when you have inflation that is higher than it's been. I am more skeptical of, I mean, I understand the arguments in, cutting edge macro about inflate, or even it's been a while in macro about inflation expectations. I'm a little less, I'm just not sure we can measure those. And frankly, I think in this episode, we had some massive supply disruptions because of COVID, not just supply chains. We had people had left the labor force in mass, like right at the beginning. We had labor shortages, we didn't have enough people. We had people switch from buying services to good. Like there were just all kinds of patterns that really fundamentally had nothing to do with inflation is going to be transitory. Though I agree, consumers in the United States, financial markets have always been team transitory. They've been real happy about how long it's taken. And yet, like what we saw last year is really a lot of those disruptions unwinding. Supply chains eased up, we got workers back, prime age women's employment rates hit an all-time high last year. We've had immigration that is 2 to 3 times what it was before COVID. And one can debate, like from an economic lens, that has been super, right? The healing on the supply side, the solving of the labor shortages, that was a big piece of inflation coming down and not having, I mean, we didn't even have below trend growth. We have above trend growth, right? So there just are a lot of things going on. And honestly, this is one case where American exceptionalism is a good thing. Like, I mean, the United States, whether it's on growth or whether it's on the level of GDP, whether it's looking at productivity measures, just so much better. And it could be for a lot of reasons. And also, like, we don't have fiscal rules. We are not going to throw it back into austerity. I don't expect maybe these big of programs going forward. But there's a lot of lessons here about what is happening. I mean, this year will be a big question mark. We can get it back to 2%.
Thank you, panelists, for speaking. We will now open up for a round of audience Q&A.
Economy right now is considered to be very robust. The long expected inflation is nil. Press conference as well as indicators in the market. We also see GDP estimates consistently beats estimation. Job market remains high, with the unemployment rates historically low. However, the indicators from the consumer sentiment shows consumer sentiment swaps consistently. So there is a clear detachment between consumer sentiments as well as the data out there published by the government. What constitutes this detachment between what the ordinary American thinks and what the economist thinks?
Do you want to take?
Just quickly, and then you can jump in. I think a big thing that has been affecting the consumer sentiment has been precisely inflation. I mean, it's hard to, as a consumer, people walk into the market, they see prices going up, and that is something that is going to affect the sentiment among people. In general, that definitely the inflation, especially over 2022 and beginning of 2023, drove the real wage growth down. So in some industries, actually, the real wage growth was negative over 2022, even though in the majority it was positive. So that also, that tends to affect the sentiment. So in terms of unemployment, it's like you said, the market is strong. As Dr. Sahm said, as Claudia said, definitely the inflation is something that has been taxing the US economy, and that it may still take a while for it to be driven back to the 2% that is within the expectations. So that would be my take on it.
Claudia, did you want to add something?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I agree. I would expect people to be gloomy because inflation has been high, right? And yet when we look at these sentiment numbers, and this wasn't, I worked with a lot at the Fed, I was one of the consumer spending forecasters, they were like 1970s, 1980s gloomy, right? Like we did not have stagflation in this cycle, right? So there is like something else here, right? And I actually wrote several pieces of Bloomberg Opinion, have talked about this. Actually, don't talk about it anymore because people get really riled up at economists when we try to talk about this. But I think the one thing that's come out recently that really has me, I think, underscores the point that there's something more than economics here, is there are surveys where they ask people, you know, how do you rate your state's economy? I think the Wall Street Journal had a recent like article on this. How do you rate your state economy? Then most people's like, yeah, it's pretty good. How do you rate the US economy? Awful. Right. And you see this pattern too if you ask people to talk about their finances, which aren't as, I mean, like you can see the inflation. They're not like knock it out of the park kind of, you know, my finances are great. But then if you ask them about the economy, economy's bad. Right. So there is a concept, and I mean, there are a few things. We are in an election year. Good news about the economy goes for one candidate and not the other. And there is just this, I think, trauma coming out of COVID. Right. We're just angry and the world has been cruel. So something is getting directed at the economy that goes well beyond economics. And yet there are absolutely legitimate economic based reasons, like people's pocketbooks, their jobs, that would make them less upbeat than say before the pandemic. We had very low unemployment and we had low inflation. Sentiment, these stuff look great, right? So there is a reason people are gloomier, but there is something here that goes way beyond my lane, and it's I don't know, it's fascinating, but it's also I think, and for all of us, and I think we mentioned too, like the economy is this very amorphous thing. Like nobody lives in the economy. We have, you know, it's about what's, you know, the kitchen table in the community. And so I think it's hard for people then to kind of get a bigger picture of what's happening across the country. And yeah, and I made the point, I made the point about the politics, but I've actually run into that from far right to far left, right? There's just a lot of like pushing on, you know, to the far left. It's like the economy is horrible because there are homeless people. And it's like, yes, we should have no homeless people. And yet we have made so much progress. Like they would want this good labor market. And from the right, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. Like if the economy is good, it's good for Biden, right? So it's a very, like, this is not an easy time to wade into how, just simple, how's the economy doing, right? Because there's a lot behind this.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions in the audience?
Yeah, a couple of panelists talked about one of the great advantages of big fiscal being solved for systematic economic approach. And yet you notice that there are a number of other factors, in the terms that the regulation holding up TSMC Arizona being extremely large, that also act as bottlenecks. So my question is, what is big fiscal, a kind of to what extent is kind of financing as opposed to other things like regulation acting as a bottleneck on key pieces of infrastructure for the development of the U.S. economy?
So I think it's important to distinguish between different time horizons for how to evaluate policies. A lot of what we have seen so far from, and fiscal policy involves a bunch of things, but a lot of what we've seen so far is the effect of the measures that have been taken so far on spending, the part of, you know, directly giving people money, etc. And that has short-term effects. You know, they create a hot economy, perhaps partly is responsible for inflation as well, etc. In a lot of the policies of this administration, they also have like a longer time horizon in mind with industrial policies for, you know, semiconductors, infrastructure, things like that. And it's very hard to have any sense at all empirically of what's the effect of these things, because they're just going to be something that whatever good or bad they do is going to be, you know, for a longer horizon. We're not going to the extent we're going to be able to measure it at all, it's not going to be soon. So we have to guide ourselves on, you know, looking at exactly what it is, using a little bit of theory to try and predict whether it's a good idea or not. If you read these acts, and I've tried, There's a lot in them. And as you can imagine, it's a mixed bag. And, you can see that all the different interest groups try to get in on the action. Some of them got what they wanted, some of them didn't, which is sort of what you would expect with any big policy that you're trying to put through. But I don't think we can say anything at all that's empirically grounded on what the effects of these things have been so far.
I'm just going to go off of what you just said, that there's a lot in them. And so when you talk about fiscal policy, it's not just throwing money at things, right? It's not just spending. And for example, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a part there that has to do about collaboration within North America. And there's incentives, actually for the private sector, for private companies to utilize components that have been processed in North America. And so North America includes Canada, US, and Mexico. And then there's also, and if we look at the CHIPS Act, which you mentioned, there's incentives for collaboration regional within Latin America. So there's money that actually has gone to Costa Rica, money that has gone to Colombia. And the sectors that they have been promoting are precisely critical minerals, because critical minerals at this moment are really important for anything. We think about semiconductors. If we think about the climate transition, critical minerals are necessary for batteries, so they're in there. And a lot of that is coming precisely from this regional collaboration. So just like Pablo said, this is something that is going to have effects in the long term, and it's very complex, right? It's much more than just financing. It's actually also incentives that are being implemented in the private, that had effects on the private sector. And I know we'll talk about public-private kind of collaboration later in the panel, but that is a component of it also.
Do you have any more audience questions?
And we talked a lot about fiscal policy, and Claudia, you mentioned how it's been very powerful. The one thing I'm talking about is how that relates to like national debt, government debt. Is this rising national debt, is that something that we should be concerned about, or is that something that is going to be productive in the long run? Or how is that related to these monetary and fiscal policies in this administration?
So the way that I think about the federal debt and is like, I think that we have twice a year, CBO puts out these numbers, and we have this big to do about how big the debt to GDP ratio, or just even how big the number is. And everyone gets very excited in Washington, DC, and the sustainability is all they want to talk about. And to me, it's like backing up and it's like, what are you doing? Right. And this is exactly the point about fiscal, big fiscal, I think of as, you've got packages that have a lot of money. And yet you can spend $2 trillion really well, or you can spend $2 trillion very poorly, right? And so it's like, what are we doing with our tax and spend priorities? Like go under the hood, come up, as opposed to getting fixated. And there'll often be spending packages where basically there's a line drawn in the sand. It cannot be bigger than X dollars. And so then you have to go and all the programs that you want in there. And this is a big thing the Democrats had to decide as they were putting packages together, because some would say it can't be more than 2 trillion or 1.5 trillion. And then they have to go in and really either completely jettison some of the programs or like really do design things to save money that are probably going to end up costing more in terms of they won't be as effective. So to me, I just think we get on these big numbers. A lot of the people who fixate on the big numbers really don't want to do what needs to be done to cut get the deficit under control. In the US, entitlement spending, so the Social Security, the Medicare, some other smaller programs, they're a huge piece of the federal deficit spending. If you don't touch those, there's just not enough discretionary spending to go in and actually make a dent in it. So I think it's more that the conversation is set up incorrectly. I'm not a modern monetary theory person. And yet I think the way we talk about it and sustainability, because we have been talking for decades that we are on an unsustainable path. There were conversations about, things would blow up. The US has something of a privilege, well, not something, the United States has a privilege to many countries, not all, some of our peer countries, where at this point, we're a good investment, we're considered one of the best investments in the world. US treasuries are in demand. Now that's a privilege that can be lost. So it's not like one wants to be cavalier about it. And but if you don't make those investments, which I think we've seen a lot in these big infrastructure chips, things that are putting in our supply side, it makes sense. But it's but I am in a Washington minority on this, right? Like when I've written about this, you get a lot of pushback. So that's unsustainable is hard. And yet I kind of put it back to people. What does it look like? Like in reality, if we were getting close to the unsustainable, what does it look like? And I don't want to hear about R minus G, which you wouldn't get that from most Washington politicians, but that's, yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
Let me just add to that. So there's sort of two things people have in mind when they, or at least two things that people have in mind when they worry about the level of public debt. One is that we're going to have some sort of Latin American style debt crisis where people start saying, oh, the US is going to default on its debt, let's not lend to them, and then we're going to have to default on our debts. I agree with Claudia that that doesn't seem to be anywhere near the horizon. So I don't, things could change, but I don't think that's the sort of thing to worry about. A different thing to worry about is that we are sort of borrowing from the future and burdening future generations with our debt. I think that's also wrong because to a first approximation, we're sort of borrowing from each other. There's some of it that is we're borrowing from foreigners and we're going to have to pay them back. So to the extent that that's true, we are maybe burdening future generations a little bit, but that's not the main thing. For the most part, we're borrowing from each other. So it's debt that we owe to each other. What is a little bit more worth worrying about, I would say, is that there's a number of explicit or implicit promises that we're making with our fiscal policies, where we're saying we're going to keep doing Medicare and Medicaid the way we're doing it. We're going to keep paying interest on our debt. We're going to keep paying Social Security the way it is, and we're going to keep taxes low. So these are a bunch of promises that we've made to a bunch of different people, and we're not going to keep all of them. So at some point, we're going to have a political fight as to which of those promises we end up not keeping. What we've been doing, and this is not the current administration, this is last few decades, is we've been postponing that fight that we're going to have one day. But one day we're going to have it, and I don't think it is of huge consequence whether we postpone it a little bit more or a little bit less. It's not like we're sort of running out of the ability to borrow or anything like that. But it does mean that somebody is going to be disappointed at some point in the future, and we haven't decided who it's going to be.
A question we did have too that kind of falls up to what a lot of us have been talking about with the infrastructure deal. And just to give a little background, in case anyone doesn't know, the Jobs Act, also known as the infrastructure deal, aims to address long-standing issues in infrastructure development, allocating approximately 1.2 trillion over the next 8 years of various infrastructure projects. These projects aim to create millions of jobs, enhance America's competitiveness, and revitalize communities. And in your view, panelists, what role does the private and public sector in the collaboration in maximizing the economic returns of infrastructure investments? And what policy frameworks could facilitate effective partnership arrangements under the bipartisan infrastructure deal?
So I touched upon this a little bit earlier, and so the Infrastructure, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that really has some tax incentives for the private sector that have been collaborating to promote growth. Now, that act actually also, that it wasn't the Jobs Act, it was the Inflation Reduction Act that has a huge proportion of it that is going to clean energy investments. So there's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, or Fund rather, and the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. Those have been given to states that now have to collaborate with the private sector in order to make sure that all of this money is actually implemented and put to the type of policies that need to be done in order to prioritize climate and pollution reduction. That requires these kind of partnerships, especially because a lot of this money is going into low-income communities that don't necessarily have the social or the social capital, but also just generally the connections, the networking capital to know who are the private collaborators and partners that can help them to implement their policies and to utilize the funds that are being given to them. So this is important. It's an interesting interplay, and it's something that is also interesting. It's an interesting line for us to walk, because we need to make sure that the public components, that the public partners, so the states, the communities, know how to connect with the private partners in order to make to use the money that they have been given, in order to be able to implement the type of policies that that money has been assigned to.
Yeah, so I think a big overarching theme of the Biden policies is that it's basically subsidies. No, so when you're starting having subsidies, you're always having the risk that there will be some kind of misallocation, that you're not going to contract with the people that are necessarily the best to develop things, but that are the best are capturing or quickly setting up companies so to maximize the exploitation of subsidies. And then also you have to look into the kind of market powers and risk of collusion. So for instance, if you look at solar panel, which is one area in which you have a lot of subsidies, it's kind of surprising that it seems that a large part of subsidies end up in the pocket of the people installing solar panel, and very little in the pocket of people. Again, because you have this kind of marketplace where it's not totally clear that people really compete, and so that's a potential when you introduce this kind of subsidies, depending on what are the kind of market powers on both sides. The subsidy can go more one way or another. So now, for instance, I think in the saving that people make, I made the calculation myself in California by going solar, are very similar to the saving that people were making 10 years ago in Washington, D.C., while both there is less sun in Washington, D.C., and on top of it, the solar panel themselves have improved quite a lot. So it means that there have been some kind of productivity gains on top of the gains for more having suns, but those gains have been largely captured by some kind of intermediaries in the installation of those type of things. Yeah.
Dr. Sahm, Professor, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything on that one.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists and audience for your questions and answers. I'm passing over the data, which is question number 2. Thank you, Laura.
So, beyond the macroeconomic consequences of President Biden's fiscal policy, we want to understand the extent to which he has impacted inequality and technological growth. He's aimed at increasing middle-class employment through investments in areas such as promoting clean energy infrastructure in rural areas and subsidizing semiconductors. However, the execution of his policies, such as housing subsidies and ARPA, have been poorly implemented and have led to unintended consequences. In light of Biden's comprehensive approach to economic policy, which includes initiatives aimed at reducing inequality, fostering technological innovation, and addressing climate change, how do you perceive the interplay between these objectives?
So I think part of what happens is that these are very different objectives. And of course, in politics, you try to package a bunch of different objectives and say this policy is going to deal with all of them at once. And I think part of that part of it is just marketing of your policies. Like, for instance, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act has very little to do with inflation, but people were worried about inflation at the time, so that's what they labeled it. And again, when you say, oh, there's going to be, clean energy to strengthen the middle class, that doesn't make any sense. But, that's how you try to sell it. There have been policies, that have been aimed at reducing inequality. In particular, the part when we just gave people money, that's very effective. And there have been policies that are aimed at sort of the transition to more environmentally friendly forms of energy and so on. That I think it's still yet to be seen how effective that's going to be. But trying to measure these policies by their stated objectives, which is to do everything at once, I think is sort of setting the bar too high, because they're not going to do everything at once. And some of the sort of the weird things you see in these policies are a result of, every different group has a different priority, and they all try to get it in the law, and then the law is a sort of a mishmash of different things.
I was just going to say, yes, you are right, in that they do have a lot of different components that don't always make sense to be in the same policy. However, some of them are actually complementary. So if we think perhaps not about the Inflation Reduction Act, but going back to the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that had a component of it which was invested into broadband equity, access, and deployment. That money was targeted low-income communities, so states, cities that are more vulnerable than others. Now, if we look at those, I believe the broadband equity, access, and deployment money was just assigned to states around June of last year. The majority of it went to Texas. So Texas actually still last year had around 11% of its population without access to a broadband subscription. How do you want to be competitive? So that's how they're complementary. So this money is going into the low-income communities, right, which are typically the ones that don't have these type of infrastructure resources such as broadband, internet access. But if we think about how that is complementary with the US being competitive at a global level, well, how do you expect the population to be competing with the population of other countries if they don't have access to broadband internet? And nowadays, we need internet to work, to study, to even access healthcare. So these are things that in a way can be complementary, even though they look like they're taken from very different playbooks. In the sense that you have to strengthen the population of a country in order to make sure that the workforce is competitive in order to compete at a global level with its trade partners, basically.
Thank you. So I think I had a look a bit earlier today at the data for inequality, and I think it's quite interesting. So if you look back, I would say 40 years before the pandemics, you have a widening of income inequality, especially at the top, but in a way that if you imagine the different social classes, the lower quartiles has a very flat income growth, the median has some growth, and the top income share has very high growth. So the richer you were to start with, the higher your income will go. And that has completely reversed during the pandemics in the aftermath of it in a very strange way. So I think they are now the big winners are both at the top and at the bottom. And actually the loser is middle class. So if you look at income inequality, since Biden became elected in January 21, since he took office, the top 10% did very well, but they have been doing very well for 50 years, plus 5%. The bottom 50% did relatively well as well, plus 3%. And the one we did poorly, in relative terms, is the middle 40%, that has basically no real income growth. And if you look into labor income, it's even more striking. So if you divide the labor force between 4 quartiles from the lower income to labor income to higher labor income. I believe the top 10%, the fourth quartile, the top has done plus 2.5, the third quartile plus 3, the second quartile is going down plus 8, and the bottom quartile plus 28%. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, they did that in 2 ways. They did that first because I think maybe they get some income as a kind of support during the pandemics. And after that, labor participation and low unemployment make more of these people in the lower quartiles have been working, and they've been catching up in terms of labor income. So that's a very strong reversal for what have been observed prior to the recent, to the last 4 years.
Thank you, Sahm. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, what a great question. There was so much in that to unpack. The one thing I would say is, you know, what you see is the unintended consequences of legislation, especially these big packages. A lot of times those are deals that were made. Those were compromises, because at the end of the day, these are political. I mean, this is legislation. This is not, you know, a bunch of economists deciding what's best. When I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors, so it was when Jason Furman was chair, so towards the end of Obama administration, so as economists, we're there to give policies are proposed in the White House, the CEA gives feedback, we try and, you know, say, hey, this would be the best in terms of the economics, the effectiveness, and kind of rank order them. And it's like, you know, if you get third or fourth best, it's like a win, right? And there are some pieces of legislation that just come out, and a lot of it is messaging, or some, you know, there's just a lot of politics. Now, that's not to say you can't do it as well as possible. And I love the point, like with the inequality, like down in the detail, like this administration has gotten and has pushed for, sometimes not gotten, more policy that's trying to help very marginalized groups. But this is down in the weeds, and marginalized groups are exactly like what it sounds like. They are never going to show up in the GDP release, right? Like you're making people more productive. You know, this broadband extending out into underserved areas. I mean, there are studies on is a massive amount of investment, even for just one hookup, because it's in rural America. But we're saying, no, you need that to be competitive in the global market. So there are investments being made. They're just very small scale. I mean, fiscal policy, it's like the grunt work of getting in there. And a lot of this happens in state and local governments too. I mean, the federal government doesn't have a magic wand. So there's that piece of just, you're really into these targeted pieces, which fiscal can do. Monetary policy cannot do that, right? Like they cannot go in and help specific types of groups that have been left behind. I think one, you know, the one thing that was very striking, I thought, with the Build Back Better agenda as it became different pieces of legislation is in the building better part of it. They had a whole set of programs. There were physical investment, so infrastructure. And then they had investments that were in people. I never liked them calling it human infrastructure, but I think they branded it like that at some point. Much of the physical, not all, there was some good housing work, you know, the cut didn't get through, but a lot of the physical investments happened. Almost none of, I mean, the big picture, not these like small ones, but a lot of the big picture investments in people, whether it was the, you know, affordable childcare, the paid family leave, the even the child tax credit didn't get renewed. I mean, that was a huge piece of Biden's agenda to reduce child poverty, and it did for a year, and then it get renewed. So that wasn't a failure of the Biden administration to push for it. I mean, they didn't have the votes, you know. So, as Joe Manchin said, you want more progressive policy, go elect more progressives. And so I think, you know, but these things are there, and they were in the queue, and they could come back. In terms of, you know, these great statistics on, and I mentioned it too, like some of the wage inequalities, the bottom to the top. We've seen some compression. I mean, we have got a labor market that is working for more people, particularly people who've been on the margins or at the bottom in like forever, right? And most Americans, like they need their paychecks to make ends meet, and we've given a leg up to people at the bottom. Now, a lot of that came from labor shortages, We didn't spring up a whole bunch of unions. There's no reason to expect that to continue in that same way. And yet you got enough momentum going. The administration helped with that. So did the COVID relief back in 2020. But you got that going. That's been good. We did give money. The child tax credit was there for a year. People were able to build up some savings. And then a lot of the programs we've talked about today that are so exciting, the infrastructure, the investments, the broadband, we're not seeing them now in the data because these take a long time, and we will probably never see them like at the numbers that get reported monthly GDP. But if we can get even a 0.25 percentage point on productivity growth, like that's the holy grail of prosperity because it adds up, right? So, and that's what those investments are aimed at, is making us more productive, more prosperous. But it is way too soon to tell. And there'll be other things come down the pike, like different kinds of technology that can add to it too. So it's the government has a lot of a supportive role. They're not in control, thankfully. So like, you know, but we're pointed in a good direction on inequality, but we are absolutely not there yet.
Thank you, panelists, for all your answers. We'll now open it up to audience Q&A.
For 2024 now, just.
Yeah, we'll
A
talk about.
question about the inflation reports about January, February. We had the background was the CPI, and CPI was a little bit above expectations. PCE was right in line with expectation for 6 months. So Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell described it as a comfortable vote. And many analysts had to say that he had many analysts who suggested Chairman Powell had a lot of hawkish things to say, but he didn't say it because he believed the word popular. So my question is really, what is your take on the 2-month slightly above expectation inflation for a little bit harder than expected, and the follow-up, and also the follow-up question.
Yeah, so can I go first? Yeah, so I worked for Powell, and I worked with the staff who gave him such smart things to say at the press conference. So I very much agree. It is so important that we do not overreact to 1 month, right? I mean, it seems pretty basic, but like, you know, 101 at the Fed is 3-month averages, right? Like things happen. It's just right now we are so attuned. And the Fed has told us, I think I'm coming around to this is the right thing to do, but it has a negative consequence in that the Fed tells us it's all about the data. It's all about the inflation data. And so no wonder if an inflation print comes out, and I mean, January was not a nice one, and markets just like go at it. And really February, I mean, it was, you know, lower is always better, but February showed some things that were in January were fluky, right? You had a step back down in the part of the shelter inflation. So that was very reassuring. So it's like, oh, look, a part of that January really was anomalous. And then there's this lovely thing called residual seasonality that the Fed has worked on for inflation for like a long time. Like this is not an unusual pattern. Now, you know, so I think it was very appropriate for him to say, hey, look, there's going to be bumps in the road. They've said that before. I think anyone who has had the misfortune of having to stare at monthly data and forecasts for a very long time would know that's the case. Now, I mean, of course, Wednesday's the big event, right? We get the 3rd month for this year. And if we keep getting numbers that are not back on track in terms of kind of we saw inflation really come down the second half of last year. We need to pick up that you know trajectory again. If we don't, I mean, they're data driven. When the inflation data have been really rough, you know, over many months, they were very hawkish, and things improved. And a couple months of data, bad data, do not, or even so February wasn't that bad. They do not undo, you know, 6-7 months of good data before that. So I think it's I agreed with his statement, and yet, you know, you always have to think about the risk. Inflation could be getting stuck. That's not my baseline. My baseline is we continue to go down. I find the reacceleration story a little harder to square, but yeah, it's really, and the markets will move around on every data release. They moved around Friday, which was absolutely inexplicable, given what the Fed has said. But nobody knows what's going to happen to inflation in the next 4 months. Like that depends if there's a cut soon or not. So no, I think he's giving the right signal. One thing that is maybe Powell actually of the group of FOMC that's out there giving a lot of statements, he does tend to sound one of the more dovish, which is a little interesting. And he's the chair, so I mean, that would make sense, but it's clear the FOMC doesn't know what they're going to do yet, nor should they. We're learning a lot.
What have you guys have done? And you had a follow-up question?
Yes, please. So former Treasury official Lawrence Summers in a Bloomberg interview, he mentioned how neutral inflation is probably well above Fed's 2% target. And it's also, as of now, there are analysts suggesting maybe some of the inflation is due to supply and demand has probably could not be easily solved by high borrowing costs. So is that something you would like to agree on, or that's a misunderstanding of the current environment?
Yes. So I think with respect to that, there already been some change now in the guidelines for monetary policy. Now we move from below 2% to 2% on average. No? So somehow it means that yes, there might be some period will be at 2.5% for a couple of years, and still maybe the Fed will let it go at 2.5%. I think.
Does the audience have any more questions?
My question would be, what's your opinion on the federal government's relationship with the Fed? Because given that it's just that the Fed is interviewing and that they're balancing the job market and inflation, how much or how should Biden balance that? And are they doing the opposite work right now? So
So the independence of the Fed, such as it is a very delicate balancing act that has been developing over several decades. The idea that there's a group of sort of indirectly elected officials that get to make decisions without elected officials telling them what to do. There's good reasons for that, but it is a bit unusual in a democratic system. And I worry a little bit that the consensus that that's a good idea might be eroding, which I think would be a bad thing, because it is a good idea to have the Fed with a relatively limited scope of what they're supposed to worry about, being given leeway to use their best judgment. And I think the current administration has sort of been on the normality path where we do let the Fed do what they think is best. I think sort of a lot of calls for the Fed to do a bunch more things than they currently do, to worry about inequality and the environment, etc., is probably putting too much on their plate relative to how much democratic oversight they have. I worry that we might go, if the Fed tries to do more stuff, or even if they don't, that there might be moves to limit the independence of the Fed. I think that would be probably on balance a bad thing.
Yeah, maybe it's perfectly true for the US. If you go to the countries, that is possibly a different story. I mean, if you go, for instance, to Europe right now, people have claimed that if the ECB has waited maybe a bit too long in order to raise interest rate, it's because I believe some some of the European countries are highly indebted, and they might be very sensitive to rapid shift in interest rate. And so in some sense, you already, I mean, the legacy of the policy post-financial crisis kind of constrain a bit politically what the ECB is doing. So they will just say, oh, we're going to buy of internet bonds because it will improve the transmission of monetary policy, but everyone knows that it's only part of the truth. The part of the truth is that they are de facto a bit acting as a kind of bailout agent for sovereign states. And yes, so that's already kind of a limit to, I don't think that's the case in the US, because in the US, the prospect of a sovereign debt crisis is very far away. But if you go to Europe, where for some countries in Southern Europe, like Italy, for instance, the prospect of a sovereign debt crisis is not very far away, then it's already putting some constraints in the way the central bank can make decisions. Yeah.
Can I? So the one thing I would add is, I mean, as was said, Congress created the Fed, right? Like, it is a political institution. Congress maketh and it can taketh, in the Federal Reserve Act, Congress has gone in and changed it over time, right? So it, like, the Fed is, I mean, they do report to Congress, but not in a like, what, you know, you're going to do with the Fed funds rate, but big picture, like, what is their mandate? What are their tools? So they have to be cognizant of what Congress, you know, how they're evaluating them. But that does not mean, there is a difference between being part of the, you know, political system and being partisan. The Fed as an institution does not care who wins in November. They care about doing their job. Their job is to get inflation back down and have us not go into recession as they do it. So they are this year just going to be heads down, do what they need to do. You know, CPI day is going to matter more than presidential polls that come out in terms of when they cut, how much they cut, if they cut. And yet the Fed, well, not and yet. So the Fed's going to do its job. It's going to put its heads down, but we won't be able to like know that for sure, right? Because already Democrats would want them to, because they really don't want to have a recession, and Republicans want them to keep it high because, you know, like, it doesn't serve them if things are great. You know, I mean, there's all this like, and you know, people want different things. Whatever the Fed does, they're going to get blamed by someone. The Fed is an easy punching bag because they cannot punch back, right? So they're always blamed for this. And yet I think they're set up in a way, and Jay Powell is very good communicating to both sides of the aisle. They're set up in a way to get to the other side of November and not have Congress coming after them. Congress may have other problems to deal with. So I think that's what the Fed's trying to do this year. One thing that I find, I'm a total fan of independence. I think the Fed should have its space to make its decisions, not be partisan. One aspect of this division that I've found problematic, and this is more how I think people in Congress think about it, the Federal Reserve is the only institution in the federal government that has a mandate for stable prices, for fighting inflation. And yet, like, we have some inflation. There are times where like Congress has much better tools to help deal with unaffordable housing because again, this is totally a matter of supply. And in fact, high interest rates don't help so much with building homes. Like, I don't think that, you know, should be their main consideration, but there are things in inflation where Congress would be so much better suited to kind of give an assist. And yet you do in a lot of the discussions have this, well, it's inflation, the Fed's got it, go for it. So I think there's a little less kind of understand, like trying to take pieces of the mandates, but I absolutely agree with a nonpartisan Fed. And I feel very strongly that this Fed, I mean, there is history before Nixon's election. And I mean, there was a Fed that did meddle in the politics. Nobody wants to be that Fed, and they're not going to be.
Can we get a round of applause for our panel speakers?